Namaste and welcome back to the JavaScript series. Today, my dear friends, I'm going to teach you one concept in JavaScript called as scope chain. If you understand this concept called as scope chain, I guarantee you, debugging your JavaScript program will become easy. Answering questions where you're expected to find out what is going to be the output of this program is going to be easy. You will literally understand where a variable is accessible, where it is not accessible, and this clarity is what will make you an extraordinary JavaScript developer. So without wasting much time, let's get started. And the first example which I want to discuss here is something which I've already typed out because I'm trying to explain scope chain for you. Now let's try to just read the code once and try to understand what it is doing, okay? So just try to watch it, a very, very simple program. Let me increase the size a little bit so you can see. I have two variables. One is username, another is user role. In username, I've given the username as Sarah, like this, okay? User role is admin. Now, if in case you don't know, different software systems where users are using it will have different roles. For example, you are also using Netflix, the developers are also using Netflix, the owner is also using Netflix. Now there are different permissions. As a user, you can only watch what is there on Netflix. As probably a developer, you have a better permission level where you're able to also upload content to Netflix. You're able to edit content in Netflix. So different software systems have different permission layers, okay? Either ways, I have a function called as check access, which I'm calling. Once I call, let's see what check access does. First thing is it creates a variable called as has access. Initially, the value is false, okay? Next, it checks whether the user role, is it admin? And strict equality we're using here so that, it will ensure that not only the value is same, the type is also same, okay? If it is admin, I'll come inside the if block and I'll create a welcome message. In this welcome message, you can see, I will fetch the name of the user, in this case, Sarah, and I'll say, Sarah, you have admin privileges, like this. After which, I will change the access to true because yes, she's an admin, she has access. Then I will be logging this welcome message, I'll be printing it. After which, if in case this person is not an admin level user, I will just come down and I will say has access and I will print it. And if they were not an admin, then the default value would have been false. If they are an admin, then the value of has access becomes true. So it will just print has access false like this, okay? If I have to just show you the output of this, you can clearly notice. If I just go, what is a user role now? Admin. So now if I execute it, it will say, Sarah, you have admin privileges, has access true. Now let us assume this person was not an admin, the person was a user. The access levels is that of a user like this. Now if I were to go back here, clear the screen, execute it, you will not get that message, you will directly get has access false. Understood? Wonderful. Point is, I'm not trying to explain the program or this logic to you. I want to explain scope chain here and all of you should understand how this scope chain concept works, okay? So I'm just resetting it back to admin. Now to understand this scope chain, what I would like here is, watch this carefully. I hope you're able to see the code as well. Now, I've explained JavaScript from the memory point of view. You know there is stack, you know there is heap, you know there is execution context, you know all of that. I'm not going into it. What you must understand is when a JavaScript program begins execution, the first thing that gets created is a global execution context, which I've already explained previously. But one more thing always gets created along with the execution context called as your scope chain. And the first thing that gets created along with the global execution context is the global scope chain like this. Now what is this scope chain? Basically it's like a register inside which we are going to maintain what are all the variables available in this scope. Variables and functions. Clearly you can see in the global scope, I am putting a boundary, imaginary boundary for you in a different color. Clearly you can notice that there are two variables, username, user role. It will make a note, username and user role. Understood? User role is admin, username is Sarah. Then it says in this scope, also there is a function which is available called as check access. It will make a note of it. So clearly you can see in the global scope of the program, there are two variables which is accessible and there is one function which is accessible. Simple. Next, you can clearly see when I call check access, obviously check access begins execution. Its execution context is created, but along with it, what is also created is its own scope or scope chain. I'll call it as the check access scope. Inside this, it will now register what are the variables and functions which has been created within this scope. And what is this? It is a function. And the function scope, if you can see, I'll just bring this bracket down so that it's more clearly visible to you. Clearly you can see the scope starts from here and ends here. Now I'm removing the global scope and I'm showing you the function scope in a different color. Understood? Now within this function scope, you can see there is a variable called as has access. Immediately it will create a variable called as has access, and it knows its value is false. So now it knows what is accessible within this scope. What is accessible to it is a function or a variable called as has access. Great. But what is interesting about this scope is now whatever is available inside its scope is obviously accessible to it, but also what is available in its outer scope is also accessible to it. And tell me, this is the function scope. What is its outer scope? Its outer scope is the global scope. I'm again bringing the boundary of the global scope. So everything inside the function scope is also accessible, and to it, everything in its outer global scope is also accessible. Understood what I'm trying to say? And hence, I'm showing an arrow mark like this, telling you that within check access, you have access to this variable also, plus you have access to these two variables and this function. I hope you will understand. This is how you have to imagine JavaScript. Next, now I call check access. Now check access is executing. Come inside. Let access is false. Very good. There's a variable called as let access, or sorry, has access, and it has been made as false. Now I'll come to the if condition. Is the user role equal to admin? Now see how JavaScript works. You are now using a variable called as user role. First thing that happens is JavaScript goes within the scope chain and sees inside check access, is there any variable called as user role? No, I don't see anything. Immediately it will not give an error. Instead, it will now move in the upwards direction to the next scope available to it. And what is the next scope available to it? Global scope. Now tell me, within the global scope, do you have user role? Yes. And hence, it has access to user role as well, though it was not created inside it. Understood? Now check, is user role equal to admin? Yes, 100% equal to admin. Condition is true, come inside. Once I come inside, now this is an if block. This is an if block. In JavaScript, we have global scope, we have function scope, we also have block scope. Blocks have their own scope. If block, else block, try block, catch block, right? And immediately now JavaScript is going to create one more entry into its scope chain, which is the if block scope. And inside the if block scope, please try to understand, it now creates a variable called as welcome message. Inside the welcome message, what is going to be the message? First of all, watch it, backticks, because I want to dynamically add a value here. $username. Oh, very good, which means you want to access this username. Now see how JavaScript works. You want access to username, first it will go inside the if block scope. It will search for username. Do you see username anywhere? It will not stop there. It will move one level above the scope, because if block is inside the function check access, which means it has access to its own scope plus its parent scope, its outer scope. So when it comes to check access, inside check access it will check, is there any variable called as username? No. Now it will not stop here. It will again propagate upwards to the next available scope, which is the global scope. And inside the global scope, it will check whether there is a variable called as username, and yes, it is there. And because it is available here, it is available here as well. That is how scoping works. Understood? And hence, it will fetch the value of username, in this case Sarah, and it will say, Sarah, you have admin privileges. That is your welcome message. That will be its value. Post which, now I am telling has access should be made as true. Is it there inside the if block scope? No, come one level above. Is it there inside the check access scope? Yes. Yes means it is accessible. It will now change false to true. Next, it will print the message. This message gets printed on the screen. post which I'll come outside the if block, and here now I will say console.log has access. Understood? And in this has access, now I am going to now print the value of has access, and now watch it. Inside which scope am I? Function scope. Inside function scope, do I have has access? Yes, it will directly access it. It will print the value, in this case true. That's it. So if you understand scope chain, trust me, your clarity will really double, triple, quadruple, and you will be able to debug easily. You will be able to understand your code much more easily, because in JavaScript, these are the common problems which people face. They're not able to understand where what is accessible. Am I clear till here, my dear friends? If this much is clear to all of you, then let me show you one thing. For example, now I will come outside this function scope. Okay, I'm outside the function scope. Now here I will say console.log, and let us assume I try to log this welcome message. Understand what I'm trying to say? Now I'm trying to log the welcome message. Oh, sorry, my spelling is wrong. Welcome message. Yeah, absolutely right. Okay. Now you only tell me in which scope am I accessing welcome message? In global scope. Because this is outside the function, in the global scope. See, I'm putting that imaginary boundary. Global scope. Now first thing is I'll go to the scope which I'm currently in. Which scope am I in? Global scope. Do you see welcome message anywhere? No. No problem now, Rohit. It can go downwards, right? That will never happen, friends. The propagation of the scope chain is only upwards, from the current scope to its outer scope, to its next scope. It can't go downwards. That propagation is not possible. And the outermost scope in any program of JavaScript is the global scope. After the global scope, there is no scope, which means it can't go upwards like this, and hence it is not accessible within the global scope. And that is why in exactly this line, you will get a reference error saying you're trying to access something which you don't have access to. Clearly, you can notice this. If I were to go here and if I were to execute, clearly you can notice reference error. This is not defined. I'm not able to find it. Now, if I were to take this, okay, cut this and put it inside the function scope. Now see, when I call check access, inside check access I'm trying to access welcome message. Now first I'll go to its own scope, check access. Is welcome message available? No. If it is not available, 100% I will go to the outer scope, which is the global scope. Is it available in the global scope? No. No means it's not accessible. I can't go downwards. Understood? And hence, even in this particular area also, you will get the same thing, which is reference error. I hope you understood how this scope chaining works. Understood? The child can access its parent scope. The child can access its parent scope. The parent cannot access the child scope. Downwards propagation is not possible. Upwards propagation is possible. Beautiful. I think I have made my point clear. Now let's reinforce our understanding by looking at few more examples. Now let's look at another example, and there are multiple things you're going to be learning through this example, okay? So let me type this out so that you understand it carefully. Now here, I'll create one variable. I'll call it as first name, like this, all right? And first name, yeah. And here I'll be giving it a value. Let's call the first name as Rohit. Awesome. Now what I'm going to do is, I'm going to create one function, okay? And the spelling is function, yeah. And here I'll call this function itself as probably outer function, like this. I'll call it as outer function. Now you'll understand why I'm calling it as outer function, okay? Now inside this outer function, observe carefully, I'll create another variable. I'll call it as outer variable, like this. And I'll give it a value. I'll say this is from the outer function. This variable is belonging to the outer function, something like that. You'll understand it, keep following. Next what I'll do is, inside this function, I am now going to try to create another function inside this function. Now the question is, can you really create a function inside a function? Yes. This, my friend, is called as a nested function, a function inside a function. You can, 100% you can create a function inside a function. And hence what I'm going to do is, I'll go here and I'll be creating another function. I'll call the name itself as inner function so that you understand that it is a function inside of another function. Now inside this, try to understand, I'll create another variable, I'll call it as an inner variable like this, and here I will say, hey listen, I am from the inner function. I am from the inner function. Clear? Great. Now I'm going to do certain experiments. Let's see what comes out of it. The first experiment I'm trying to do here is I'll try to log the value of the inner variable. So let me see if I can directly access the inner variable here. Keep your answers in your mind, okay? Next what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to probably just copy this line, and here I will try to now print the outer variable. What happens? We will see. After which what I'm trying to do is I'm going to go here and I'm going to try to print the first name. I'm going to print the first name. Alright, great. Now whether it will be accessible or not is the question, we'll figure it out. After which what I'm going to do is I'm going to come outside this inner function, but I'm still inside the outer function. Now inside the outer function, I am going to call the inner function. I repeat, inside the outer function, I have the inner function. Now inside the outer function, at this point, I'm going to call the inner function. Clear? So watch it. I'll come here and I will say inner function like this. Beautiful. Now I will come outside my outer function. I've come outside the outer function. Now outside the outer function, I'll call the outer function. Okay? So I'll just come here and I will just call my outer function like this. This, my friends, is my example code. Through this, scope chain has to become clear to you, access has to become clear to you. Okay? So let's try to build the scope chain so you'll understand it better. First and foremost, always the first thing that happens is the global scope is created. Inside the global scope, global variables are made a note of, and globally accessible functions are made a note of. Now, which is a global variable? A variable created in the global scope, and the global scope is a scope which is outside all the functions, right? This is a global scope. There you can see there is a variable called as first name. I'll make a note of it, values. Next, there is a function which has been created, outer function. I'll make a note of it. Rohit, will inner function not be created? Definitely not, because inner function was created inside the outer function, not in the global scope. Understood? And hence I have these two variables. Beautiful. Now see, when I call outer function, then it will now create a scope for the outer function. Now in the outer function, it will see that the programmer has created a variable called as outer variable, which is inside the scope of the outer function. I am showing you. It will make a note of that called as outer variable. It will give the value. Next, it says programmer has also created a function called as inner function, which is again inside the outer function scope. It will now create it. Understood? Now we made a note. And as I've told you, obviously this will have access to the global scope. The child will have access to the parent. The inner will always have access to the outer. Right? So please understand, outer function is the inner scope. Global scope is the outer scope. So inner will always have access to outer. Outer will not have access to inner. Understood? And hence the arrow mark. So inside outer function, I have access to these two guys and these two. Clear? Awesome. Now watch it. Next what happens is, here I am declaring a function called as inner function. Just declaring a function is pointless. Only if you call it, it will execute. But right below that there is another statement where I am calling the inner function. The moment I call the inner function, its own scope chain is implemented, in which now it sees that inside the inner function, programmer has now created a variable called as innerVar using let. And let will 100% respect the function scope. And now see, this is the inner function scope. Now inside the inner function scope, you are creating a variable called as inner variable. It gets created and a value is assigned from inner function. Beautiful. Obviously, it has access to its parent scope, which is outer function. And since outer function has access to the global scope, this also has access to the global scope. I hope this has become clear to you. Now watch it. Inner function is executing. Once inner function is executing, inside that I am saying console.log inner variable. Now tell me, is inner variable accessible? How to predict whether it is accessible? First go to its own scope. Is it accessible? Yes, 100% it will print the value. Next I am printing outer variable. First check in its own scope. Is it accessible? No. Go one level above. Is it accessible in its parent scope? 100% outer variable is accessible. It will print. Understood how it works? Next I'm saying print first name. First check in its own scope. Not accessible. Go one level above. Is it accessible in the parent scope? No. Go one more level above. Is it accessible in the global scope? Yes, my friend, and hence first name is also accessible. So I'll be able to print all three values. After which inner function is done. It gets, its execution is done, its execution context gets cleared. All this in depth I've explained to you in the previous videos. And I highly recommend those viewers who have directly visited this lecture of the series to go back and watch all the fundamental classes, which will really build a solid understanding of JavaScript for you. Moving on, try to understand. Now what is going to happen here is inner function executed because you called it. Where did you call it? In the outer function, right? Now outer function was executing. Now outer function is also done because there is no more statements. Inner function also finishes execution. Outer function also finishes execution. Clear? Great. Now see, let's just check whether what I said is true. So if I bring up my command prompt and execute it from inner function, that is this value, from outer function and the first name. All three are accessible within the inner function because of the scope chain. Now next what I want to show is what if I were to now take this printing this inner variable, I cut it and I try to access it outside the inner function. Outside the inner function means where am I accessing it? See, this is the inner function scope. This is the outer function scope. Where are you accessing this inner variable? You are accessing in the outer function scope. Now when the outer function wants to print inner functions variable, first thing what will it do? It will come to its own scope and it will see, is there a variable called as inner variable? No. But it will not stop there. It will move up the chain and check in the global scope, is it accessible? It is not accessible and hence it says reference error. It can't go downwards. It can only go upwards. And is why here if in case I were to go and execute it, clearly you can notice, my friend, you have got reference error. Okay, great. Same thing is what I can now say. If I were to take this, cut it, and I were to paste it in the global scope. Now it is in the global scope. So when I want to access inner variable, first check in its own scope, not accessible. Now I can only go upwards, but there is nothing above global scope. It is the outermost scope. Obviously it is not accessible. And hence if in case I go here, if I execute, same reference error. I think I have made my point clear, right? So through this I hope your understanding of scope chain became slightly better. Also you understood that you can have a function inside another function. This is also possible. Clear? Beautiful. One last example if I solve, complete clarity you will get. Make sure you listen to the last example as well. This last example, if you can understand, it means you have understood the entire scope chain process of JavaScript. Okay, observe. I have a simple program here. You can easily understand the logic. There's nothing complicated. But I want you to understand if you know how to build the scope chain. Try to understand. First part of the scope chain is always the global scope. In the global scope, you have to make a note of the global variables and the globally available functions. Now clearly your eyes should be able to notice that this let city is created in the global scope. It will make a note of it. London is the value. Next it will see show weather is a function which is created in the global scope, and I'm showing the global scope for you as a reference. Understood? It will clearly make a note of show weather. Next also it sees there is one more function created in the global scope called as greet. It will also make a note of greet, which means globally in this program you have access to the variable city and two functions, show weather and greet. Beautiful. Now watch it carefully. Here now I am calling this function called as show weather. The moment you call a function, its scope chain gets created. Now inside the scope chain, I am putting its scope for you. I am putting its scope for you. Now look at the scope of show weather. If I look inside that, I see there is one variable called as temperature that I have created in its scope. Immediately it will make a note of that. There is no inner functions here. Great. Next I'll come down and now there is an if block which has been created. Immediately I will now go and I am going to now make sure that the if block scope is created. In the if block scope, I will first see, is temperature lesser than equal to 20, right? Tell me, is there temperature inside this if block? Not there. Doesn't matter, it will go one more step above in the scope. But in the show weather scope it is available, which means it is available to if block. Obviously it has access to temperature. Is temperature less than 20? Yes. If condition is true, come inside. And now I am creating a variable called as let jacket needed. Where have I created it? Inside the block scope of if block. And hence inside its scope chain, jacket needed is created. And yes, if the temperature is less than 20 degrees, obviously it's a very chilly environment, and hence I'll say yes, jacket is needed, true. Understood? After that, I'm printing a message, console.log, I'll just remove the scope chain for a second. Console.log, it's chilly, I'm printing the city, then I'm printing temperature, and I'm printing the temperature, okay? Now focus all of you. Now I'll bring back the scope chain. Here what you need to understand here is, now it's chilly and you're trying to access this variable called a city. How do you know whether it is accessible? First check in its own scope. Which scope are you in? The block scope. Is there a variable called a city? No. Move one level above. Is it available in the show weather scope? No. Not available. No problem. Move one more level above. Is it available in the global scope? Yes. Which means it is available in the if block scope. And hence it has access to city. It will say it's chilly in London. Full stop. Temperature. Now it wants access to temperature. Is it available in its scope? No. Check one level above. Yes. And hence access it and print it. It's chilly in London. Temperature is 18 degrees Celsius. Clear? Now go to the next line. Console.log. Do you need a jacket? And I'm printing true or false. Jacket needed. I need access to. First I'll check in my own scope. Is it available? Yes. Print it. That's all. Now I'll come outside if and I'm saying console.log jacket needed. True or false I want to print. Now think logically. You are accessing jacket needed. In which scope are you accessing it? Inside the scope of show weather function scope. First check in its own scope. Do you have jacket needed? No. Which means what will it do? Go one level above. Is it available in the global scope? No. But Rohit, it is available in the block scope. But block scope is below. I can't propagate below. I can only propagate above. I can access my larger scope, my parent scope. I can't come down to my child scope. Is why in this exact line, you should get reference error. And if you get reference error, you must understand it is because you created this variable in the block scope. But you're trying to access it in the function scope. Yes? And hence if in case I were to go here and I were to execute as per our expectation, you can see jacket needed is not defined. But a beginner of JavaScript will be, what do you mean is not defined? I have created it. Why is it not accessible? That's not how it works, friend. If you wanted access to this, then move it to the function scope. Where you created temperature, you create it there. Then it is accessible in the if also, it is accessible in the function also. This debugging skills, if you don't have, it's difficult. Okay? Great, awesome. Now what we need to essentially do is, I hope you understood this as well. Clear? Now if I were to say comment this line, now I'll not get any error. Now show weather is over. Now you are calling greet. When I call greet, obviously its own scope is created. Understood? Next, inside that, have I created any variables? No. Have I created any functions? No. So it is empty. Now there I'll go and say console.log welcome to city, and I'm accessing a variable called as city. First check in its own scope. Is city available? No. But don't give up. Move one level above to its parent scope. Who is the parent scope to greet? Global scope. Is city available in global scope? Yes, so it is accessible here as well. And hence it will say welcome to London. Simple as that. Each and every one of you understood what I'm trying to say. And hence now if in case I were to go here and execute my program, it's chilly in London, temperature is 18 degrees Celsius. Do you need a jacket? True is the output from the show weather function. Next, welcome to London is the output from the greet function. I hope everybody understood whatever it is that I wanted to convey through this class. So I hope once and for all, scope, scope chain, what is global scope, what is function scope, what is block scope has become clear to you, and you have some sort of visualization that you can maintain when thinking about these topics, which is the fundamental ability a programmer should have, visualization, right? Anyways, thank you so much for listening. I again urge all of you to like, subscribe and comment to the channel. It really helps us a lot. Take care and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.